I am the local council advisor for the Wiltshire Association of Local Councils. But for over 20 years, I worked as a professional in the market research industry, and I have retained my membership of the Market Research Society to support our members as a benefit. And obviously, it's that experience that I've prepared a series of presentations around some good research and consultation technique. And this is one of a series of sessions we've run. And this session is going to be on the topic of data analysis. So the way it's going to work is we'll have an initial presentation by myself. There will be an opportunity for questions and answers, and then there'll be hopefully time before we finish at 1 o'clock where you get to perhaps ask questions about the projects that you're working on, and we can have a think about that. Now, one of the previous presentations I gave was on planning a research process. And I think it's useful to get a refresher of what that looks like, particularly with a view to the to where data analysis fits in, because data analysis is a really important part of any research project. There's no point doing a load of fantastic research, speaking to hundreds of people, gathering hours worth of data if you don't actually have an opportunity to do anything with it, or the time to do anything with it, or if you haven't given any thought to how you're going to present that ultimately in a report. So the research planning process is about identifying what it is you want to do, who it is you need to speak to, but most importantly, always having in mind what is the end result, what is the purpose for which you are undertaking a research or consultation exercise. And I think if you've always got the end result in mind, and sometimes I talk about that being about the final report, almost having a structure, or even if it was only a table of contents of the final report, even before you've even done anything, even before you've put a plan in place, because that way you'll always make sure that everything that you do feeds back to what is going to be in that final report. And most importantly, what was the question that you were seeking to answer? That is singularly the most important thing to have in mind. And of course, data analysis and the process by which you go through analyzing, you do the methodology, you do the field work, you've got the data, understanding that data in the prism of what you're trying to achieve, what question you're trying to answer is really important. Now, this is a bit of a no-brainer, but this really sort of sets out why understanding data, why gathering data, if you like, is important for our town and parish councils. And, for me, whether you're talking about a business or any form of institution, a charity, a school, it doesn't matter. Good data is about informing the decision-making process. What decisions are you going to make? And how can you support that process through gathering feedback and information? And obviously, a lot of what we're seeking to do with the data that we collect is understanding how the public engage with with your services, and obviously what they think of those services. So, of course, service improvement is, another important element of this. But a good research process, and I found at the end of my career, I was most impressed by the town and parish councils that I worked with, less so than the principal authorities, that actually if you're undertaking a genuine research project because you are genuinely interested in understanding what the general public think, actually the process of going through that and reporting back the findings really does help to build trust and transparency in a way that perhaps I think a lot of people have lost faith with a lot of public consultation exercises, because they believe that the decision has already been taken. You're just ticking the boxes. You're wasting my time by asking me a load of meaningless questions because you've already made the decision. And that's annoying. One of the other areas where I think gathering data is really useful is evaluating the effectiveness of schemes and projects that you've done. And one area that I'm conscious that a lot of our parishes and town councils will be involved in, whether no matter how big or small you are, is giving grants. So actually, for community schemes who are taking public money, definitely to do good work in your communities, well, actually evaluating how effective that was, that sounds like a good idea to me. It certainly would be useful for the public to prove that that money has been disposed of in a good way. So actually understanding how those projects have gone, what worked well, what didn't work well, what could be done better in the future, that's a really good use of that's really important knowledge. And perhaps that sort of data isn't data that we necessarily think about, and when we're thinking about different types of data. Because when we think about different types of data, we think about, the archetypal spreadsheet, the quantitative data. This is the bar charts, this is the pie charts, this is 57% of people said this and 32% of people said that. That's what we normally think about when we're thinking about data analysis. And of course, that's actually got a lot of, there's a lot of value in that. The work that I've always enjoyed is more qualitative data, what we would consider to be helping us understand people's motivations. So the two can work together because we can understand preference, we can understand why people are doing what they're doing, or their behavior, because 57% of people have told us that they've got a preference for this type of thing, this type of service. But actually, the qualitative helps us understand why. What's the knowledge that underpins that? What are the motivations that make people hold those beliefs? And whereas the quantitative data often comes from surveys, whether they're online or door-to-door surveys, the qualitative may come from those discussion, people sitting down together, talking in depth and giving where the interviewer has an opportunity to not be so structured, to sort of pick apart opinions and try and understand what sits behind them. So obviously there are different types of data, but there's a whole range of different mechanisms that enable you to collect that data. And the first couple of sessions I did, I've got a sneaking suspicion I'm going to say this every single time we do a session like this, but there was a time when I'd been doing this because I'd been trying to sell you something. And actually, I think that no matter how big or small the council is, I think you've got a lot of resource, you've got a lot of intelligence that enables you to do an awful lot more of this work yourselves. And you should be more ambitious about what you can generate for your council and your community. You don't necessarily need to buy a lot of this stuff in. Sometimes you do, but you don't necessarily need to do it. There's a lot of guidance out there, and this particular document that I've put a hyperlink in the slide. Obviously, I'll circulate the slides to everybody after the session, so you've got these links. I'd really recommend you have a look at this, because what I really like about this information is it sets out the different type of data collection mechanisms that you can use, and it provides a sort of narrative as to how effective they are, how complex they are, what you can use to what you can get out of them, because obviously some forms of data collection can be quite sophisticated. Others can be the simple door-to-door survey that you can create yourself. So there's a lot of information out there, and hopefully part of the reason for us doing this, particularly today, is to give you some insight into the different sources of information, the different options that might be available to you, which means that you don't need to go around and commission somebody to do these types of projects for you. Um, uh, this is a sort of a summary of some of the things I've been talking about in terms of the different sources of data. These things I'm sure you'll all be familiar with, particularly from the questions, from the questionnaires to the online surveys. But also, I know we're living in the social media age. We know that people posting on social media is an opportunity for comment, and of course, actually, for the data collector, for the researcher, it's also a rich vein of insight. Now, of course, it can feel like the Wild West on social media, and you can get ranty people who write sort of angry things about stuff. But that doesn't necessarily mean that understanding what they're saying and why they're saying it, particularly if you think, well, that's just simply not true, then even that is a finding, even that is insight, because of course what it says is that we've got an education piece. People need to understand more about this issue, and then they wouldn't feel that they do. So again, it's not about necessarily spending money or hours collecting data. What data is available to you already? What data can you can you look upon? Because if you think about that slide I showed at the beginning, which was the research process, from planning all the way through to sort of reporting, if we were doing anything, it's always a really sensible thing to think about is don't reinvent the wheel. If the information that you are interested in already exists, why on earth would you spend hours or days of your time trying to go out and find it out all over again? That would be crazy. And that's why what I've put at the bottom of this slide, as one of the sources of data that we need to be thinking about is secondary data. So that's data that already exists. It's already been published by somebody else. I guess, the example of that we're all most familiar with will probably be the census, the information you can get from the census office. And I don't know how many of you have necessarily sort of gone online and had a bit of a play around with that data, but it can be very localized. It's a tool that, if you're not familiar with, then we could even do a session just on that, because it's actually informative. There's a massive amount of data in there. It will tell you some really interesting things about your community. But there's other sources of secondary data, and you see I've listed them here. There's reports from government departments. You've got research studies from universities or think tanks. There's data from the local authority, and other organisations as well produce data. And I'll give you an example of what some of these are. I started off with the example of the, hello, it's not working. There we are. Oh no, look at that. You see, I pressed it twice. Right. I started off with the example of the census. Now, what you may not be aware of, because if for any of you who have looked at census data before, it will obviously tell you about, the town, the county, the region that you live in. One of the things I like to do with the current data is, this is an analysis of an area where I live in central Wiltshire compared to the Wiltshire average. Now, I'm not going to go through each of these different six variables, but it is interesting to see, this is free. Once you know where it is, it will take you seconds to create an analysis of how your community either compares to the county average or how it compares to other communities. If you think you have a community that's very similar to yours in terms of its size or its, socioeconomic makeup, then this data can help really underpin what that looks like. It evidences it, and of course, by evidencing it, it gives us greater confidence that the decisions that we're making, that we're on the right track, basically. There's some other very good sources of data. I've picked out here under my sort of government heading. This is a report that was is published in the House of Lords Library about high streets, life beyond retail. There's quite a few of these sort of studies that are available post-COVID, because obviously we know that the world we live in today is different to the one that we went into before the pandemic. Although actually the trends, if anything, have sped that up. Now, of course, Wiltshire's an interesting community because we're familiar with our market towns, but also we've got lots of very rural communities as well. But understanding what is going on in our high streets is a really interesting question. It's going to be something that I'm sure concerns people across Wiltshire and Swindon. And actually, there's already quite a lot of research out there that indicates trends. So actually, there's nothing to stop you doing a business survey of businesses in your area. But why on earth wouldn't you start off by actually trying to get your head around what the national picture is, some examples first? And again, this information is freely available. Many years ago, I did a bit of work for the Institute of Public Policy Research. They've got a good reputation, and of course, you can find a lot of their research online. That's not difficult to do. In fact, actually, if you're interested in the polling work of organisations like YouGov, for example, then they publish a lot of their data. It's all freely available online. It's very insightful. And of course, we would expect there to be data that's produced at a local level. This is a website that has I found it through the Wiltshire Council website. There's a number of public bodies that feed into this website, and again, you can use it to drill down and try and identify information for your local area. And based on an area, what are you interested in? Is it about healthy living? Is it about education and employment issues? Is it about deprivation? You can see that actually there's quite a lot of data, all freely available, that's out there. This is another very similar to the last example. This is the Wiltshire Community Foundation website, which again is in. There's a hyperlink in the slide, and this enables you to drill down into all sorts of different data sets and use a mapping tool to identify the areas in Wiltshire and Swindon, to sort of give you that insight. And I couldn't let a session like this go without giving a plug to the National Association of Local Councils, of course, who themselves produce information. Obviously, you'd expect their information to be of interest to town and parish councils, and they are a part of the function of the National Association is lobbying. So actually understanding what's going on in our sector, presenting that data up to government is of interest. But of course, actually, if we ever wonder how our councils compare to other councils in the Southwest or across the rest of England, then actually the data produced by the National Association could be useful. So all of those freely available, secondary data sources, don't reinvent the wheel, plenty to be getting on with. But once you have started your own exercise, once you have identified the information that you're interested in collecting, then that's when we get back to our research planning process. That's when we start having in mind, okay, what am I collecting and what am I going to do with it? And we've got here on the slides you can see there's the key information. So how many, if you're doing a survey, how many responses have you received? How did you gather that data? If possible, can you identify whether or not there's a geographical distribution? So for example, did the study that you do have a particular, is there a certain type of respondent? Historically, a lot of the pieces of work that I did, you seem to get a lot more women than men filling them out. There might be other issues as well in terms of whether a subject is particularly of interest to younger people or older people. And perhaps getting an idea about the geographical distribution of respondents within our area might also give an indication of whether or not this is something that has it necessarily engaged with people with the hard to reach groups, people who perhaps might be living in areas of deprivation. Has it been skewed to people who are perhaps a little bit more engaged in possibly more affluent areas? Because understanding all of those things, rather than trying to dismantle what we're doing, it helps us to understand the limitations of the data. And it's much better that you understand any potential bias than a critic understands it. It can't be an afterthought. It is important to understand those limitations. The good news is that all data is valid. So all data is a valid finding. The question is that level of validity, and that's where we get really excited about the sample size, the number of people who responded. It has to be a big number, because if it's a big number, then we can have confidence in the validity. Well, yes, of course we can. But actually, if you get an insight, no matter how small, and that takes us back to that sort of the crazy comment on Facebook page, actually, so that could give us a bit of a window into a problem, a bit of an understanding, even if it's only one. If we're getting insight, then that's what we're using the data for. Where it's a bit easier to not get so caught up in the number of responses is when we are going down the qualitative route. So that is, looking at codes, looking at comments, grouping them into themes. That process is called coding, and then trying to sort of pick apart what those themes are telling us. Again, really important to relate that back to what our objective is. There's research projects have the capacity to tell us lots of really interesting things about stuff, but actually it would be really useful if what they were informing is the decision that we were trying to take at the time. Now, one of the things I think, I wouldn't go as far as to say it's a debate within the research industry, but of course there is an interesting relationship between the qualitative and the quantitative. So once I've grouped my comments, I'm inevitably going to want to say, well, actually, the most frequently identified comment was X. So the weird thing about this slide is it is taken from a project that I did, and it was around the issue of parking. But of course, it's a quantitative representation of a qualitative issue. And I think the challenge here is that we get really excited about the data that we've got, and we think this is a really useful way of representing the variety of different comments that respondents have raised. But is it actually telling us anything? Because frankly, the more I look at this, the more it looks like a magic eye picture. There's so much going on. I'm not necessarily knowing whether I'm really getting through to the core issues, but it's a representation of the comments that people have made. And I've got my n equals 576 on here, so you know how many people have made it. So it all looks very, you know, it looks very professional and everything. But actually, is it telling me anything? That I don't necessarily know that it is. So I've got a bit of an example for you around this sort of analysis of qualitative comments, and I rather bravely, I think, used as an example the survey that we did following last year's county conference and the comments section. So, are there any comments you wish to make about your experience at the conference? Now, for my own purposes, I basically split these comments into two. So everybody who said something nice, that was written down as what went well, and I've got a nice little list of things there. And then, of course, inevitably there are the comments that, you know, where people want an improvement, and I've rather diplomatically phrased those as better next time. So that's a very simple, easy to use way of taking a lot of comments, a lot of feedback, splitting it simplistically into two elements. You know, what went well, what could we do better next time? Probably one of the easiest and the quickest ways of managing comments without wanting to get into lots of detail. But there are other ways that you can manage lots of comments, and perhaps part of this is about the question that you're asking. But for the purposes of this presentation, I produced a word cloud. Now, if you thought the pie chart earlier was a magic eye picture, then I'm sure we can all agree that this is completely impenetrable. But word clouds are something that is that are more common and more popular. You've probably all seen them yourself. There are tools online that mean you can do them. You can do them for free. And actually, if you did have a survey that said, you know, what do you like best about the parish, or, you know, what's the top priority for our council over the next 12 months, then actually producing a word cloud could be quite a nice way of kicking off that conversation and giving people an understanding of the variety of different words that were being used. The one area that I haven't touched upon or that I haven't referenced yet is AI. And of course, when um, increasingly we're using AI to help us manage complex tasks and undertake them in a quick and efficient way. So I took all of my comments that were left to the survey, to the conference survey. So that includes, you've seen the two previous slides, what went well, what could have gone better. You've seen the word cloud, it's telling us nothing. But what has AI got to tell us? Well, I have to say, please, nothing would have given me greater pleasure, particularly as a sort of a former professional market researcher, to say that AI was a load of old rubbish and that actually there are no quick fixes, and that that really you've got to do the work yourself. I have to say, it produced this in about, I don't know, 20 seconds, and it is pretty impressive. It's grouped all of the comments together. It's given me a code. It's allocated me a code. It's identified a frequency. So if I wanted to, I could still make a pie chart if I absolutely had to. And most importantly, it's given me some example comments, because when you're building a code frame, I always feel that it's a very individual exercise. So, you know, if I was doing if we had all these comments and I gave a spreadsheet to everybody who's on this call, we'd probably come up with 8 or 9 different code frames, because, you know, when you read something and the connection that you make with it can be a very personal judgment call. But the structure of what we're seeing here with the AI example is absolutely textbook. What is the theme? What is the code? What is that level of frequency? So we're getting a lot of the same comments. Where are they coming? And I need an example, because I can't just say catering. I can't just say org. I need to be able to explain to people what I actually mean. And here it does it. And it just produced this. I didn't even tell it to produce it like this. I just asked it to analyze my comments, and this is what it did. So I am impressed. But it always is important with AI to remember that it doesn't do the job for you. It helps you do the job. So always having that quality assurance, rereading, reviewing, testing is really, really important to make sure that what you're getting out of AI is what you expect. Um, Moving back to the data analysis process, and actually the last slide is a good example of this. Identifying key findings is obviously really important, not just because you want to learn something, but obviously because when you're going back to the report or the presentation that you're making, you want to be able to tell people the so what question. So what does this mean? Well, of course, if you've got a large proportion of people all saying the same thing, it's a very clear mandate. If there are two schools of thought, if actually opinion is split, then that tells you, and you know, if it's a local issue, it could be contentious. And sometimes, if you've got the capacity, sometimes the smallest issues which you park because you think only one or two people have raised that, might actually have the greatest consequence or the greatest benefit to your community. So just because something appears to be a relatively marginal or niche issue doesn't necessarily mean that when you're thinking about the subject in the round, it isn't something that you want to consider. The fact that one person brought it up may be enough to say, look, actually, we maybe need to do a bit more here to understand how this is affecting a certain part of our community. Um, One of the points I made earlier was about that transparency, the importance of transparency, because it helps reinforce the idea that one, you are genuinely interested in knowing what your community thinks, and you demonstrate that through the way that you feed back to your to the people who've helped you with the project, to the residents, to the community at large. Obviously, the way that that information is presented to councillors, um, and that you take into account when doing that the sort of the critical lessons about where bias might exist. Have we included a diverse range of voices in our community? What have we done to engage with people? There's only so much that you can do, but actually just think about it. It demonstrates that you've tried. If you then say, look, we just didn't have the time, or we didn't have the budget, we didn't have the opportunity to do that, it's fair enough. It's an honest answer, but much better that you think about it in advance than than you get caught short or get caught on the back foot when you're trying to, present that to your community. And of course, the way that we present to the community is equally important because we want to make sure that the reports that you produce are accessible, that they're transparent, that people understand what you're saying and why you're saying it, and that actually, the first part of this, as I put in the slide, is about timeliness. And if we lived in a perfect world, if we had Hermione Granger's time turner, then actually it would be a lot easier to do this because I know that you're fitting in these types of projects around lots of other work that you're doing as well. But by timely turnaround, again, not only is the issue fresh in everybody's mind, but of course it does reinforce that idea that you've taken it seriously, you've invested time and effort in making sure that the findings are out there, and the council is considering it, and that actually you've reflected upon what you've been told, and you might well have an action plan. You might have sort of policies or decisions that you're gonna take. I also think that when you're doing these exercises, it would be great to have some time put aside to reflect. What could we have done better? Was there a section of our community that didn't engage? Why was that? Have we got any ideas about what we could do differently next time? Can we work with different organisations in the community to access the people who work with them? Have you got a football club? Have you got a rugby club, a cricket club? Have you got, I know that the sort of the archetypal one is the WI, but obviously there are schools as well. What opportunities, what groups are there out there that can potentially act as a conduit, to help your research go viral. But inevitably, part of telling that story in your research report is about the mechanisms that you're using. And I just, before we finish, wanted to give you a couple of examples of the ones that I like doing. I think I've made it pretty clear. I'm not a great fan of pie charts. Certainly didn't like the pie chart that I made earlier. One of the things that I do tend to use is, are these sort of bar chart type designs. I think the technical name is well, I think they're also known as candlestick graphs, charts, but actually there's another thing about margins of error. So the simplest way of me communicating this to you is basically this bar chart that uses a traffic light design. So for positive scores, it's very green, all the way down to very negative scores, which are very red. And of course, the amount of red or the amount of green or the amount of amber gives you an immediate visual um, representation as to what people liked or what people didn't like. You know, where's the concern? If I want to know what this is telling me, it's intuitively a lot easier to sort of get that with a well-known color scheme like like the archetypal traffic light. But one final example of the presentation of data, both in terms of helping you to analyze, but also telling the story to the audience that it's intended for, is the use of maps. Now, this is a map of a community in Yorkshire, and in this community, I did a piece of work around the issues that people were having with parking. And what you'll see in this map is where people have raised their issue with parking. So we've got a geographical locator, and we've also got a color scheme going on here. You will see, obviously, it's predominantly red, but there are also some, hopefully you can see them, some green indicators as well. And the green indicators simply indicate where the parking scheme is working well, where it has solved the problems it was introduced to deal with. And the red pins identify where actually there is a problem. And of course, by then going deeper into those, we can understand what the type of the problem, what type of problem it was, and where it is and how it was manifesting itself. But that's a sort of a visual representation that can obviously be used for lots of things. You know, you could use it for sort of mapping antisocial behaviour. Are there areas in your community that are suffering from a particular type of problem? You know, there might be other projects as well where you could use that approach. But it's one that I think work really well. The website is called Mapline, and the first instance of the software is free. But obviously, the more functionality, they want you to take out a license. But there we go. Right then, that probably took me a bit longer than I was expecting, and I've been talking an awful lot. So I think if anybody does have any questions, I will now pass it to the floor.